The beast was a creature born from the raw heart of the wild, its form larger than any living animal that men had seen in their lifetimes, its fur dark as storm clouds and its eyes glowing with an ember light that spoke of ancient power. It walked the forests and the mountains as if they were its throne, its roar rolling across the valleys like thunder, its steps shaking the earth like a storm. Its presence was feared, yet also respected, for many whispered that the beast was older than kingdoms, and older than the roads men built across the land in villages near the edge of the great forest. People spoke of the beast in hushed tones. They called it a terror, yet they also called it a guardian, for though it was fierce, it did not destroy without reason. It defended its territory with unrelenting strength, and when hunters strayed too deep into its domain, they returned with stories of glowing eyes in the dark, and the sound of branches breaking as if giants moved through the trees. Some did not return at all, and their absence gave fuel to the legend of the beast. Beast had lived countless seasons, and in those seasons it had faced fire and flood and blade, yet it had always risen strong once more. Many warriors came seeking glory, hoping to claim its head as a trophy to prove themselves worthy of song, but none had succeeded. The beast fought with a force that no weapon could match, its claws tearing through shields, its teeth breaking spears, its body moving with the swiftness of wind and the strength of stone. The earth itself seemed to bend before it despite its strength. The beast was not without heart. It had been seen once with cubs by its side, small and curious creatures who followed it closely as it moved through the forest, their cries soft and wild, their tiny paws leaving faint trails in the mud. This sight gave the villagers pause, for they saw not only a monster but also a parent one, who fought for its young, just as any mother or father of the village would do. Yet the fear of the beast was stronger than sympathy, and hunters still plotted its death. The kingdom grew restless as rumors spread of the beast moving closer to farmlands, crops ruined by its wandering herds, scattered by its scent, and travelers too afraid to walk the forest roads. The lords declared that the beast must be slain, and so they sent men armed with steel and fire, a company larger than any sint that had faced the beast before. They carried banners of the crown and songs of triumph already on their lips, believing themselves destined to bring down the creature that had defied men for generations. The day came when the hunters entered the valley where the beast roamed. The air was thick with the cries of ravens circling overhead, the ground heavy with the marks of giant paws. The men advanced with weapons raised, hearts beating fast between fear and ambition, and in the shadows of the forest, the beast watched, its eyes burning, its breath heavy as the wind began to rise. The battle was about to begin, and the fate of the beast was about to be written in blood and legend. In the valley where the hunters had gathered, the air was thick with tension. The sound of armor clinking and horses stamping on the soil echoed against the hills. The men whispered among themselves, though they tried to hide their fear. Each one knew the stories of the beast, and each one knew that no warrior had ever returned victorious against it. Still, they held to the promises of gold and honor the crown had offered, for the head of the beast, the leader of the hunters, was a man of pride. His voice loud and his sword sharp, he raised his banner high and told his men that this was the day when the monster would fall, and their names would live forever in song. His words stirred the hunters, but even as they shouted their cries, the forest around them seemed to laugh with the whispers of leaves and the low growl of something unseen. The beast appeared from the shadows with a presence that silenced the valley, its body massive, its fur bristling, its eyes like burning coals. It stepped forward with slow and measured power, and the earth trembled beneath its paws. The hunters raised their spears and notched their arrows. The leader shouted the order to strike, and the battle began with a fury that shook the ground. Flew through the air, but the beast moved with the swiftness of wind, its body twisting, its claws swiping them aside as though they were nothing. The hunters rushed forward with swords and shields, their voices loud with fear and courage, yet the beast met them with a roar that broke their lines like a wave against stone. One hunter was thrown aside by the force of its strike. Another crushed beneath its weight. Cries of pain and panic filled the valley. Despite their losses, the hunters pressed on. They were many, and the beast was one. They surrounded it, striking from every side, steel cutting through its hide. Though the wounds were shallow, the pain only made the beast fight harder. It lashed out with teeth and claws, sending men sprawling. The ground became slick with blood, both human and beast. The valley echoed with the clash of war. The leader charged forward, his sword gleaming in the dim light. He struck deep into the side of the beast, his blade sinking through thick fur and flesh. The beast howled, a sound that rattled the hearts of all who heard it. The cry carried across the forest, calling the cubs that waited hidden beyond the trees. They answered with small cries filled with fear, and the beast turned its head for a moment, its eyes filled with sorrow. That moment of weakness gave the hunters their chance. They surged upon the beast, driving their weapons deep, striking again and again, until the great creature staggered, blood pouring from its wounds. It roared once more, not in rage but in defiance, a sound that carried the strength of 1,000 storms. The hunters stepped back, watching as the beast swayed its body, refusing to fall, until at last it collapsed upon the earth with a thunderous crash that shook the valley. The hunters stood over the fallen creature, their breaths heavy, their faces pale. Though they had won, their victory was not without cost. Many of their brothers lay broken around them, the ground a field of death, yet they raised their weapons high, claiming their triumph over the beast that had haunted men for generations but far beyond the circle of hunters. The cubs cried out, their small voices rising into the air, as the heart of the forest mourned the fall of its greatest guardian. When the last echo of the beast's roar faded into silence, the valley grew still. The hunters stood with heavy breaths and weary limbs, their weapons dripping with blood, both theirs and the beast's. The air carried the bitter smell of steel and sweat, mixed with the earthy musk of the fallen guardian. The men looked upon their prize with awe, for the beast lay unmoving, its massive frame sprawled across the ground, like a mountain broken. Among the crowd of onlookers who had followed the hunters into the valley was a woman. Her name was whispered among the villagers as one who carried kindness in her heart. She had not come for glory or for gold. She had come only to see the truth of the legend that had haunted her people for generations. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes fixed on the great fallen creature, her hands trembling as though she felt its pain within her own chests. The hunters shouted in triumph, raising their banners high. Some cut pieces of the beast's fur as proof of their victory. Others laughed and boasted of their courage, yet the woman did not hear their words, for her gaze had fallen to a place the others did not notice. She saw movement in the shadows, near the massive body, small shapes, shifting, with tiny cries, soft and desperate sounds that pierced the noise of celebration. She stepped closer, though no one paid her much mind. The hunters were too busy praising themselves to care for a lone woman in their midst. Her eyes widened as she saw them clearly nestled against the blood-stained earth were the cubs, their fur a lighter shade than their mother's, their bodies trembling as they pressed against her still side, their cries full of fear and hunger. They nuzzled against her as if willing her to rise again. The woman's breath caught in her throat. Her heart ached for the tiny creatures, for they were too small to fend for themselves and too weak to survive without the care of their mother. She knelt in the dirt, her hands reaching out yet hesitating for a moment. The cubs looked at her, their eyes glowing faintly with the same ember light as the beast, though softer and filled with innocence, not malice. The hunters finally noticed her, and some laughed, saying that she should leave them be, for they were the children of a monster and would grow into killers like their mother. But the woman did not listen. Their words rolled over her like empty wind. She felt only the pull of compassion, stronger than fear, stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. She touched the smallest cub, gently lifting it into her arms, its body warm, its heartbeat fast against her chest. The other cubs pressed closer to her as if sensing her kindness. In that moment, something changed in the valley. Though the beast was gone, its spirit seemed to linger in the air, watching as the woman gathered its children with care. Her eyes no longer held fear, only a silent promise that she would not let them die. She rose to her feet, cradling the cubs against her. Bafta the hunters sneered and turned away, seeing no value in the small creatures, yet the woman knew their worth, for they were not monsters to her. They were lives entrusted to her by Thetas. She walked from the valley. The cries of the cubs grew softer, comforted by her presence, and the earth seemed to sigh, as though it too had witnessed something far greater than a battle. It had witnessed the birth of a bond that would defy the fear of men and the memory of bloodshed. The woman carried the cubs away from the valley, her steps slow and careful, for their small bodies were weak and trembling. The forest around her was hushed as though it mourned the fall of the great beast, yet it also seemed to watch her with quiet curiosity. The wind rustled through the branches, the river murmured nearby, and the fading cries of the cubs blended into the song of the wilderness. She held them close to her chest, feeling their warmth against her heart. When she reached the edge of the forest, night had begun to fall, the sky painted with streaks of fire and gold that slowly darkened into shades of deep blue. The woman paused and looked back at the valley. She could not see the hunters now, but she knew they had left with their trophies, their laughter echoing faintly in the distance in her arms. The cubs stirred their soft whimpers, carrying the weight of loss and hunger. She whispered words of comfort, though they could not understand her. Her voice, gentle like the wind that carried through the trees, returned to her small home. a cottage of wood and stone resting at the edge of the village. When the villagers saw her carrying the cubs, their eyes, widened with fearsome, cried out that she was cursed, that she had brought monsters into their midst. Others warned her that the cubs would grow into beasts like their mother and turn against her one day, but the woman paid them no heed. She walked past their fearful stares, her steps steady and her gaze firm. Inside her cottage she laid the cubs down on a blanket near the hearth. The fire flickered, casting a warm glow over their tiny forms. They curled together, their eyes glimmering faintly in the dim light, their cries fading into soft breaths. The woman sat beside them, her heart torn between fear and resolve. She wondered what fate awaited her if she chose this path. Yet, when she looked at the cubs, so small and helpless, she felt her answer already written. She could not abandon them. She could not let them die. That first night was long. The cubs woke often, their cries piercing the stillness of the dark. She searched her cupboards for food, grinding what little grain she had, mixing it with water and honey to form a thin broth. She fed them, carefully guiding their mouths to the bowl, their tiny teeth nipping at her fingers as they learned to eat. She laughed softly despite her exhaustion, her laughter mingling with their squeaks and huffs when at last they slept. She watched them, their sides rising and falling in rhythm, their warmth filling the cottage with a strange sense of peace. Outside, the wolves howled and the wind pressed against the shutters, but inside the fire burned steady, and the woman felt a bond forming as fragile as a candle flame, yet strong enough to hold back the darkness. The days ahead would not be easy. She knew the villagers would turn their whispers into threats. The cubs would grow and their needs would grow with them. Yet in that quiet moment she felt a strength rising within her, a strength she had never known before. She reached out and touched the smallest cub, brushing her fingers across its soft fur, and whispered a vow, though no one else could hear. She would raise them, she would protect them, and she would not let fear decide their fate. The woman carried on with her days, tending to the cubs as though they were her own children, though every step she took was watched by wary eyes. The villagers spoke in whispers when she passed their doors, and they pointed at the small shapes that padded behind her, their voices filled with fear and disapproval. They said the cubs were not meant to live among humans, that they would grow into killers and bring ruin to the village. Yet the woman did not falter. Her heart had chosen its path, and she walked it with quiet determination. Each morning she rose before the sun, her hands busy with the work of preparing food and water for the cubs. They grew stronger with each passing day, their legs steadier, their eyes brighter, their cries turning into playful growls as they tumbled across the floor of her cottage. She watched them with a smile, though her body was weary, for she spent much of her time caring for their needs. Still, their joy gave her strength greater than she had ever known. The cubs followed her wherever she went, through the fields and along the forest edge, their small paws leaving prints in the soil. The villagers would watch from a distance, clutching their children and shaking their heads. Some pleaded with her to rid herself of the creatures, saying that when they grew older they would turn on her, but she would not listen. She saw not monsters, but orphans who had lost their mother in a battle not of their choosing. There were nights when doubt crept into her heart, when she lay awake, listening to the cubs breathing softly beside the hearth. She wondered if the villagers were right. She wondered if she was raising danger beneath her own roof. But then one of the cubs would stir, pressing its tiny bafta against her leg, seeking warmth and comfort, and the doubts faded like mist before the morning sun. She knew then that she could not abandon them, no matter the costs. Weeks passed. The cubs began to explore further. They chased butterflies in the fields, they splashed in the stream, their laughter like wild music in the air. When one stumbled, the woman lifted it back to its feet. When another grew frightened of the dark, she held it close until sleep claimed it. Their bond grew stronger, each day like roots sinking deep into the soil, unshaken by storm or fear. Villagers could not deny what they saw, though they refused to say it aloud. The cubs grew not into wild terrors, but into loyal companions. Their playful spirits brought light to the woman's home, though the people still feared what they might become. There was no denying that in her care they had found a gentleness that none believed possible. The woman knew challenges would come. The cubs would grow larger, their hunger greater, their strength more difficult to manage, but she also knew that the bond they shared was not fragile. It was a fire that would burn through doubt and fear. She stood by her hearth each night, looking upon the cubs with pride, whispering to herself that no matter what the world thought, she would raise them, she would guide them, and she would protect them. For they were hers now, and nothing would break that truth. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched into months. The cubs grew with astonishing speed, their bodies no longer small and fragile, but sturdy and restless. Their paws struck the ground with confidence, their eyes glowed brighter in the firelight, and their cries deepened into the first growls of strength. The woman watched this change with both pride and caution, for she knew their growth meant new challenges, yet she never let fear touch her voice when she called them by her name. Morning began with their eager cries. They would tug at her clothes, urging her to open the cottage door so they could run into the fields. Together their playful leaps sent grass flying through the air, their teeth flashing not with menace but with joy. She chased them laughing, though her breath came quick and her legs grew weary. She had not known such wild freedom since her own childhood, and though she was tired, she found her spirit renewed in their presences. Their strength grew, so too did the whispers of the villagers. They said the cubs were no longer harmless. They said they would soon hunger for more than grain and milk. They warned the woman that danger would come sooner than she believed, but the woman would not surrender. To their fear she answered only with her actions, showing each day that the cubs could be taught, they could learn, and they could love. She trained them gently, guiding their instincts with patience. When they bit too hard, she corrected them with firmness, but never cruelty. When they leapt too wildly, she steadied them with calm hands. When they strayed too far, she called, and they returned bounding to her side. Their loyalty already strong, though they were still young, she taught them to respect her voice and her touch, and in time they began to follow her commands with eagerness. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and painted the sky in fire, a cry rang out from the village. A child had wandered too close to the river and slipped into the current. The villagers rushed in panic, their shouts filling the air, but it was one of the cubs, who moved first, racing with speed that no man could match. It leaped into the rushing water, its body cutting through the current with fierce determination. The woman ran after it, her heart in her throat, as she watched the cub grasp the child in its jaws, lifting gently, without harm, and carrying the little one back to shore. The villagers fell silent, their fear broken by awe. The cub laid the child at their feet, its head bowed as though waiting for approval. The woman rushed forward, gathering both the child and the cub into her arms, her eyes shining with tears. She looked to the villagers, and for the first time they had no words of scorn, only silence heavy with wonder. That night, as the cubs slept by the hearth, the woman sat beside them, her hand resting on their warm fur. She knew the road ahead would still be filled with doubt and resistance. Yet she also knew something greater had begun. The cubs were not only hers now, they were part of a story that reached beyond her cottage and into the hearts of all who had witnessed their bond. She whispered softly that no matter what came, she would stand with them, for they were no longer just beasts, they were her family. The seasons turned and the cubs grew tall, their frames strong and powerful, their paws striking the earth with weight that shook the ground. They were no longer the tiny, helpless creatures the woman had once carried from the valley. Now they stood as young guardians, their coats gleaming in the sun, their eyes sharp with awareness, and yet their hearts still bound to the woman who had given them life when all else had abandoned them. The villagers watched with unease as the beasts grew. Their whispers grew sharper, their warnings louder. They said the woman was a fool, that she had raised monsters in her own home. They claimed it was only a matter of time before the creatures turned upon her and upon them. Yet though their words were heavy with fear, none could deny what they saw for the cubs. Though fierce in form, never brought harm to the villagers. Instead, they kept to the fields and the forest, always close to the woman who guided them with her voice and her touch. There came a night when wolves descended upon the village, drawn by hunger, their howls echoing through the darkness. The people cowered in their homes, clutching their children. The hunters scrambled to ready their weapons, but before they could strike, the cubs, now grown into strong and swift beings, leaped into the fray. Their roars split the night as they met the wolves with ferocity. The clash was swift and brutal, the cubs driving the intruders back with claws and teeth, their loyalty to the woman extending to all who shared her village. When dawn came, the villagers emerged to see the ground marked with the tracks of wolves. Driven away, the cubs stood at the edge of the village, their bodies scarred but unbowed, their eyes glowing like embers in the pale light. The woman stood between them, her hands upon their fur, her voice calm as she soothed them. The villagers stared in awe, unable to speak, for they had seen with their own eyes that the beasts were not monsters but protectors. From that day, the whispers changed, though fear still lingered in many hearts. A new respect began to stir. Some called the woman mad still, but others began to call her blessed, saying that perhaps fate had chosen her to tame what could not be tamed, to turn fury into guardianship. The children of the village no longer hid in fear when they saw the cubs. Instead, they followed from a distance, laughing, as the beasts leaped through the fields, their once dreadful roars, now like music that promised safety. Woman knew the path was not without danger. She knew the cubs still carried the blood of the great beasts that had fallen in battle. But she also knew that love could shape even the fiercest of spirits. She walked the village with her head held high, her companions at her side, their bodies towering, yet gentle in her presence, and though the world outside still might call them monsters, the people within the village began to see what she had always known, that family is not only born, it can be chosen and forged in fire. And lost that night as the cubs lay beside her hearth, their bodies stretched wide, their breaths deep with sleep, the woman whispered her gratitude. She thanked them for their loyalty, their strength, and their love, and in her heart she knew that the story of the fallen beast was no longer only a tale of fear. It was becoming something greater, a legend of hope. Years passed, and the cubs grew into mighty beings, their frames towering above men, their shoulders broad, their claws sharp, and their roars rolling like thunder across the valley. They no longer looked like children of the wild, but like rulers of it. Yet despite their power, they remained bound to the woman who had taken them in. They followed her steps with the same loyalty as when they were small, their eyes softening whenever she called their names. The villagers could no longer deny the truth. They had feared these creatures for so long, yet they now saw them as guardians, for no bandit dared to strike their homes. No predator dared to cross the boundary of their fields. The cubs stood watch each night, their eyes glowing in the dark, their presence alone enough to keep danger at bay. The people whispered that the beasts were no longer curses upon the land, but gifts sent by fate. Though still they dared not draw too close. One autumn evening trouble came in a form greater than wolves. A band of raiders swept across the hills, men hardened by war, carrying fire and steel. They struck at the edge of the village, shouting as they set torches to the fields. The villagers cried out, scrambling to defend their homes. Their hunters fought bravely, yet the raiders were many and stronger than they had ever faced. It seemed the village would fall, but then the roars came not of men but of beasts. The guardians charged, their bodies like storms unleashed. They leaped into the fray with a force that scattered the raiders. Their claws tore through shields, their teeth broke spears, their eyes burned with fury. The raiders, who had come with fire, now faced a fire far greater. They fell back in terror as the guardians struck again and again, until the ground itself shook with the weight of their fury. Woman stood among the villagers, her voice rising above the chaos, calling to the beasts, guiding them with her words. Her presence, the anchor that kept their wrath from consuming all. She commanded them, not with force but with love, and they obeyed, striking only those who sought to harm. The village, the raiders fled into the night, leaving behind their dead and their weapons abandoned in the dirt. The village was safe. The battle ended. The villagers gathered in silence, their eyes fixed on the woman and her guardians. Some wept with relief, others knelt in gratitude. The beasts stood by her sides, their breaths heavy, their bodies streaked with blood, but their heads bowed as if waiting for her praise. She placed her hands upon them, her voice soft as she thanked them for their courage, her words carrying through the night like a prayer. From that day, the villagers no longer whispered in fear. Instead, they spoke with reverence, calling the woman mother, not only to the beasts, but to the village itself, for she had raised protectors. Where others had seen monsters, she had turned the children of a fallen beast into guardians whose loyalty was stronger than any wall or weapon. And so the legend grew. No longer was it said that the beast fell in battle and left only terror behind. Now it was told that from its death rose a bond of love and strength, a bond that would guard the people for generations. The woman smiled quietly in her home that night, her guardians resting by the fire, and in her heart she knew their journey was not yet ended. Time moved as it always does, the seasons circling again and again. The woman grew older, her hair turning silver, her hands lined with age, yet her spirit remained unbroken, and at her side the guardians stood still, mighty still, loyal, their eyes watching over her as they had since the day she carried them from the valley. They did not leave her, even as the years weighed upon her body, for they were bound by something greater than blood. They were bound by love and choice. The villagers no longer feared them. Instead, they honored them. The children of the village grew up under the watch of the guardians, and to them the beasts were not monsters but protectors. They would sit near the woman's cottage, listening to her tell stories of the cubs when they were small and weak, stories of how they played in the fields and tumbled in the grass, stories of how they grew into the towering beings that now watched the hills. With silent strength, the children laughed and clapped their hands, their eyes, shining with wonder. Travelers began to arrive from distant lands, seeking the truth of the tale they had heard in taverns and markets. They came expecting to see monsters, but they found a quiet woman and her guardians resting by her hearth. They found peace where they had expected fearsome, carried the story back to their homes. Speaking of the bond between human and beasts, a bond that defied the laws of nature and war, the story spread farther with each telling until it became legend. The woman knew her life would not last forever, yet she found no sorrow in this thought, for she had lived a life filled with purpose. She had taken what the world had called impossible and turned it into truth. She had given love where others would have given fear, and from that love grew something stronger than death. She looked upon her guardians each night as they lay by the fire, their massive bodies curled like shadows of the mountains, and she whispered her gratitude, knowing they understood. Though they never spoke, there came a night when the sky was filled with stars, brighter than she had ever seen. The woman sat outside her cottage, her guardians resting beside her. The wind carried the scent of the forest and the sound of the river. She closed her eyes and listened to the earth breathing around her, and in that moment she felt the spirit of the great beast watching from beyond. Its eyes, no longer filled with fury but with pride, for its children had not been lost. Its children had become protectors. When the woman's time finally came, the village gathered in silence. They carried her gently to her resting place, and the guardians walked beside them, their heads bowed, their steps slow. The people wept, yet also smiled, for they knew she had left behind more than memories. She had left a legacy. The guardians stood watch at her grave, their roars echoing across the valley, not in grief, but in tribute. In the years that followed, the guardians remained near the village, watching over it as though her spirit still guided them. They became symbols of strength and loyalty, their presence a living reminder that love can change even the fiercest of hearts. The story of the woman and the cubs lived on, passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, until it became a tale spoken, not with fear but with reverence, a tale of family, a tale of hope, a tale of the beast that fell in battle, and the human mother who raised its cubs as her own.